2 of the Nourishing Tomorrow, the Future of Food Systems podcast, where we will be exploring the impact of climate change on agriculture. I am your host, Prudence Zoe Glorious, and with me is Dr. Michael Ojo from GAIN. Karibu, Daktari.
Asante Sana Prudence, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Michael Ojo. I'm the country director for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, in Nigeria. It's one of 10 countries where we have a country program working with the government and the people of those countries to tackle the root causes of malnutrition.
Mhm. So, Dr. Ojo, let's start by getting to know you. I want you to tell us about the food of your childhood, a food that really tugged at your taste buds. What was your favorite, and would you call it environmental friendly?
I grew up in southwestern Nigeria, and I was born into what you might call a middle income, middle class family. But our food was still very much staple based. So lots of yam, lots of cassava, and so on. We had lots of fish. We had eggs occasionally. Meat, not so much, because it was rationed. We had chicken on special occasions. And on Sundays and maybe one other day in the week, we would have rice. Um, but the other thing that we had lots of was fruits. And when I think about my childhood, that's really one of the things that I remember. Having lots and lots of fruits. The other thing I remember was I was made to eat lots of beans. I hated them then, but I love beans now. Environmentally friendly, I think the main feature for me was how many miles my food at that time had to travel. And back then, a lot of the food that we consumed came from not very far away. So it was certainly more sustainable compared to my diet today.
It was more sustainable compared to your diet.
Absolutely.
Okay, so there's a lot of changing environmental patterns. Let's look at that connection between the food of your childhood and how climate change has impacted that. Apart from the distribution and of this food, what has the environmental changes, or how has the environmental changes impacted the food of your childhood? Let's start with beans or the fruits.
Yes. I mean, I was really going to. I wanted. The way I'm thinking about this, actually comparing what I used to consume with what my children consume today, and both of my children are young adults now. Both of them actually live in the United Kingdom, where you can get pretty much any type of food that you want from any part of the world. And this is part of what makes London and those types of cities really attractive city spaces to live in. But also, it speaks to the pressures on our food systems and on our climate systems to produce and supply the demand for these kinds of foods in those types of cities. So they both eat differently. My son's diet is very typical of the Western diet with lots of meat, chicken meat, and so on each of his plates. My daughter, she's more diverse in the kind of foods that she consumes. It's a balance between staples and animal source foods. However, I live and work in Nigeria. And when I look around me at what children these days in the country context are eating, you find that their plates, what's on their plates depends on the family's financial circumstances. So on average, children from fairly high income families consume red meat at close to European levels. They typically eat lots of processed fast foods. The staples on their plates are not as diverse. Some of them actually eat rice virtually every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Very few pulses, very few beans, little or no fruit or vegetables at all, and lots of sugar sweetened drinks to wash it all down. poorer kids in Nigeria, on the other hand, basically feed on staples and on pulses, and quite often with little or no accompaniments to that. They are forced to rely on locally produced vegetables um, as stews or soups to provide some diversity. And I say forced because this is the perception. They don't see vegetables or pulses such as beans and lentils and so on as healthy. They see them as poor people's food. Animal source foods such as chicken, fish, eggs, milk are really only consumed occasionally.
Okay. So is
And red
there
meats even less often.
okay?
Yeah.
So is there a connection between like all
All of
these
that and
change
climate,
patterns? Is there a connection between how our climate is changing and
Absolutely.
food security?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, connecting all of that to climate change, what we see is that the intensification of food production systems for food, especially foods like red meat, to make them available and more accessible and more affordable for Western diets, especially including people like my children, is taking a disproportionate toll on the natural environment and its resources. The food on some plates are getting cheaper, but the costs in terms of environmental impacts are being felt elsewhere I mean, disproportionately in sub-Saharan Africa and in the South, global South more widely. I have some figures drawn from a variety of sources, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Global Nutrition Report, Food and Land Use Coalition reports, and so on. And food production systems that mainly services these demands that I talked about are increasingly producing cheaper foods, but are also responsible for a third of all greenhouse gas emissions globally. It's responsible for 70% of all freshwater abstraction. So all freshwater use is connected to food production. 80% of deforestation that we see is connected to food production. 70% of biodiversity on land and 50% of biodiversity in our aquatic systems is connected to food production. 40% of all available arable land is used for food production. But maybe the most tragic part of all of this is that 40% of all of the foods that these systems produce is actually lost or wasted due to food system inefficiencies and failures. And disposal of the wasted food is also a big part of the contributions to the climate, to the global greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the connections between the way that our food systems currently work and the really intense impact on climate.
Thank you for the statistics. So when you look at the statistics and the trends, do they create opportunities or challenges? And can you speak to both?
Yeah. So I think, the global trends that we see, which also affect the continent, in most cases more acutely, are increasing CO2 levels, increasing temperatures, uncertain rainfall patterns, and so on, increasing incidences of floods and droughts and soil degradation, multiple heat waves, and so on. So all of these things that we see, unfortunately, actually nearly always equate to challenges. However, the opportunities come from trying to address or tackle these challenges. When you look at all the climate projections and the implications for food systems, they all assume that we continue to do exactly what we've done the same way, produce food the same way. But if we make sustainable changes, then we can avert the worst of these predictions. An example is with biofortified crops. These are nutrient-enriched varieties of commonly consumed staples. And the nutrient enrichment is actually done through years of um, improvements, applying conventional breeding techniques to these crops. And at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, we've been working with producers and the science community over the years to make this what we call biofortified crops more accessible, more available. And we're talking about crops like maize, like cassava, like sweet potato that are enriched with vitamin A. And we are working to connect people to them more, to make them more easily accessible. People consume more of these foods, whether as just primary foods or as slightly processed foods and so on. And this is an example of an adaptation opportunity from the challenge of increasing costs of food, the depletion in the nutrient content of soils, and other degradation that's caused by climate change. So these are the ways that we can connect the challenge that this brings to opportunities.
Wow. So biofortification is one of the sustainable ways of enhancing our food systems. Is there any other way that an African farmer or an African player in the agricultural field can sustainably adjust to the changing climate?
I mean, there are many ways. There is increasing focus now on going back to age-old African ways of managing soil, managing natural resources, agricultural practices that we used to have, and maybe putting some more science behind them. So now we talk about regenerative, climate-smart agriculture. This is not new to Africa. And basically what's happening is these approaches are being codified and they're being translated into different contexts. So one of those codifications is something called High Yielding Resilient Adaptive Practices, or HYRAP. And it has to be high yielding because we're trying to feed more people.
Yes, yeah.
It has to be resilient because these practices must be able to bounce back from the impacts of climate change. They have to be adaptable because of the increasing unpredictability of the climate, including rainfall patterns and so on. And so these are examples of how African farmers can respond and adapt. One other thing we are promoting is the return to some of the underutilized, neglected crops of Africa. Some of these forgotten staples and pulses that used to form big parts of our diets and have been lost because of changing tastes and the influence of marketing of different types of foods from other parts of the world. So, different types of beans, grains like millet, and a few other crops of that type. Animal source foods like insects, like mollusks, like snails, and so on. These are all opportunities, and this can be sustainably produced locally, and they can be produced abundantly, and they can form part of a revised diet for Africans.
Thank you, Mr. Ojo. I believe every African nation has an insect that is a delicacy.
Absolutely.
And when you spoke
Highly nutritious too.
and very nutritious and
Absolutely.
very yummy. So that's one way we're keeping our food system sustainable, by going back to that. And you also spoke about neglected crops that we also need to revisit as farmers and players in the agri system. In our country, we actually say that these these former crops, are good for the behavior of the land. So we can always
This is
revisit that,
very
and
true.
yes, and because that's the way we will stay resilient. So, Dr. Ojo, what is that one thing that everyone should be doing to take care of our planet?
That's a really good question. If I was to give one thing that I would like all of us to take away, it's to reduce the distance that the food that you eat has to travel. So
It should come from my garden?
as much as possible from your garden, if not from your garden, from a neighbor's garden, if not from a neighbor's garden, from a local farm, if not from a local farm, from somewhere within the country, rather than the way that we currently consume foods, which relies a lot on imports of different types of foods, many foods that are not local to us, and all have an implication, not just in terms of how they're produced, but also how they get to us, in terms of the energy used and the implications for greenhouse gas emissions. So reduce the distance that your food has to travel. Produce as much as you can of what you eat. And that would go a big way towards helping us to balance out the impact of agriculture on climate.
Amazing. So, fact or myth? African farmers are experiencing more unpredictable weather patterns due to climate change.
Fact?
African governments are not taking significant steps to address climate change.
Fact, unfortunately.
Interesting. Climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts are more challenging for African countries due to limited resources and infrastructure.
Fact again, unfortunately.
Oh, thank you so much for your time, Dr.
Thank you.
Ojo.